I welcome you all to this important session titled Parenting Through the Storm Dealing with a Catastrophe of Teen Suicides. This session is brought to you by Mentorsa, an international Islamic psychological mentoring platform dedicated to guiding individuals and families through faith based and psychological solutions. We are honored to have with us Wafi Shihad, the director and chief mentor of Mentorsa. He is a renowned theological psychologist with years of experience counseling youth, especially teenagers, certified in emotional intelligence from IIT, and has worked as a professional consultant with FC Canada. His expertise in merging Islamic principles with modern psychology has made him a trusted mentor for families worldwide. Tonight, Wafi Sar will help us understand the psychological struggles teens face, explore the causes of teen suicides, learn practical and faith based strategies to support our youth. Now, let me read out some rules and guidelines. Keep your microphones muted, avoid interruptions, and maintain respect in the chat. The session is being recorded, so please avoid sharing sensitive information. Thank you for joining us. Now I will hand it over to our speaker, Wafisa. Jazakumullah khairan.
Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah. Am I audible? Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. In the name of God, the most beneficent, the most merciful. Alhamdulillah wa salatu wa salamu ala rasulih al-amin wa ala alihi wa ashabihi ajma'in. أما بعد رب اشرح لي صدري ويسر لي أمري واحلل عقدة من لساني يفقهوا قولي. Parenting is one of the hardest jobs in the world. The task that a parent has to do on a daily basis and the stress that a parent goes through when it comes to parenting, guiding the child as they grow in life, holding the hands of the child and helping them navigate through the challenges of life, left and right, up and down, north to south, and south to north. It is something that is extremely stressful. And this parental stress, it is very, very less discussed. And more than that, when it comes to parenting today, subhanallah, the kind of challenges that parents have to face today is it's exponentially more than the challenges that the parents had to face in the past generations. And therefore, today we have a generation of parents who are facing the hardest challenges. And one among them is a challenge that has affected the youth to an extent that it has become a huge catastrophe. And that is the catastrophe of teen suicide, subhanAllah. The kind of cases that are propping up every single day. In the newspapers, in the magazines, in the news portals, we get to see that everywhere. Children aged 12 and 13 and 14 and 15 and 16 and 17 and 18 and 19 taking the decision to end their life. SubhanAllah, it is something that is extremely astonishing. When we look into the world statistics, we see that every 40 seconds, someone takes their own life. And among them, teenagers make up a very, very significant and heart-wrenching proportion. In the United States alone, suicide is actually the second leading cause of death among teenagers aged 15 to 19. And that's something we have a lot to think about. And when we come to India, the scene is not very different. We live in a very globalized world. And this globalized world, the phenomena that happens in a lot of these countries are actually very similar. And especially when it comes to suicides, we see that the scene is almost exactly the same. And the reason why we are having this conversation here and now is because of an incident that really, really shook me to the core. It has left me really, really saddened. And that is the unfortunate death of one of my students. And his name is Mihr. was a very, very wonderful student, a person with a lot of good character, with good personality. He was there with me in a few of my travels as well. And he was there in the sessions that he used to attend in the Mentorsa classes. He used to be very attentive, was very focused. And he traveled with me a few weeks ago, was so happy. He was so happy that he could come in the IMT under Mentorsa. And he had a lot of plans, a lot of visions, a lot of dreams. And a week ago, I got a call from his mother. She was crying and she was facing palpitations and she was suffocating. And she said, "My son is gone." And that was something extremely shocking for me. I couldn't believe that Mihir have gone. He has passed away. And then I traveled with my wife to their place and was a few hours of drive and we reached there by night. A lot of things happened after that and it was extremely, extremely unfortunate. Let's all keep Mihir in our du'as. We'll have a minute of silence with respect to Mihir passing away. Please make sure to make dua for him. Keep him in your prayers. The story of Mihir, it is not just a one-time incident. It is something that has been a daily story in the newspapers internationally. We're having our youth facing a lot of challenges. And when it comes to the death of our own children, it is something that is extremely, extremely hard, very hard for any parent to basically go through. And this is not an easy topic to discuss, and I know that, but it's a reality we must face together as parents. And a lot of parents they fail to understand the depth of the issue, the seriousness of this issue, and a lot of us parents we live in this optimistic delusion that we have built for ourselves, thinking that our children are safe, thinking that our children don't have suicidal tendencies, thinking that our children are living in this dreamy world where in which there is nothing wrong happening in their lives. But we need to understand our children may not always open up about these issues that are happening in their lives. So this is a topic that must be addressed, and the gap between the parents and this generation of children. We know about Gen Z, we know about Gen Alpha, but now we are having another generation that is called as Gen Beta, Generation Beta. So the gap between the parents of this generation and the upcoming generations is basically increasing on a daily basis. And one of the biggest gap is with regards to how the parents of this generation look at the situation of the children. I was recently in Qatar. Before 2 weeks, I went to Qatar for a program, and there I was having sessions with the parents and I was having sessions with the children. And I got a lot of counseling cases. I got a lot of counseling cases, and the number was so staggering that I thought of opening a counseling office in Qatar. That's how huge this number was. And then when I talk to the children, and the children tell me about the struggles that they're going through, pornography addiction and drug problems, and a lot of these things that are happening. And then after that, I talk to the parents. But the parents, some of these parents don't even believe that it's an issue, right? They don't even see them as an issue to the extent that they don't believe that it's happening there in Qatar. So the gap with regards to how the parents are viewing the problems of this generation, it is increasing, and it's very important as parents who want to guide our children, we fill this gap. We become more cognizant of the reality that this generation is basically living in. A lot of statistics, 1 in 5 teenagers in the United States, they contemplate about suicide. According to the World Health Organization, 77% of global suicides occur in low and middle income countries where mental health resources are often limited, especially when it comes to India. Especially when it comes to India, where in which there's a lot of stigma when it comes to the field of psychology. Going to a psychologist and talking about a mental health issue is something that is very stigmatized. that is very stigmatized in both religious circles and non-religious circles. So the mental health resources we have around us in our society is very limited. You look around yourself and ask yourself, how many psychologists do you actually know in the society who are working in the field of mental health? So mental health is extremely important, and the death that we are seeing in around us, when it comes to teenagers, it's a clear signifier. It's a clear pointer that it's time that we give it the focus that it rightly deserves. That it rightly deserves. Now, an important question we should be asking as parents is this: why are teenagers so vulnerable to suicide? As I mentioned earlier, every 40 seconds, suicide happen in the world. But then, if a huge number of it is actually contributed by teen suicide, then the next very question is, why are teens vulnerable? Now, if you are a parent, can you type yes in the chat? If you are a parent, type yes in the chat. If you have children, type yes in the chat. All right. If you have teenagers, type okay in the chat. If you have teenagers, type okay in the chat. If you have more than one child, type C in the chat. The letter C in the chat if you have more than one child. Okay. Now, as parents, when we give tarbiyah, nurturing to our children, and we have multiple children at home, we get to see that when a child enters the age of teenage, a lot of their personalities, a lot of their characters significantly change. It changes quite a lot that a lot of parents actually become extremely confused on how to basically handle the child. So teenage is actually a phase that is very, very different from any other phase. When we learn developmental psychology, we learn, different categorizations of child development, 0 to the age of 3, 3 to 5, 5 to 7, 7 to 10, and 10 to 13, and then we have the teenage, the early teenage, and the middle teenage, and the late teenage phases. But when it comes to the teenage phases in the field of developmental psychology, when we look at the astonishing categorical differences that are there between the earlier phases of life and the teenage phase of life, it is staggering. It is staggering. How many of the parents here have experienced this? When your child has entered the phase of teenage, you see them changing quite a lot. If you have experienced that, type yes in the chat. Type yes in the chat. If you have seen your teenagers like go through a massive change when they enter that phase, type yes in the chat. And this is actually one of the core reasons why teens are specifically vulnerable to suicides, my dear brothers and sisters, my dear parents here. One of the core lens with which we should be looking at the issue is actually from the perspective of neuropsychology, from the perspective of brain development. So when a child enters the phase of teenage, what happens is their brain is on a developmental phase. And it develops very, very fast. So the PFC, the prefrontal cortex, is basically underdeveloped in teens, and it basically continues maturing until the mid 20s. Until the mid 20s. Now the PFC, the prefrontal cortex, is actually something that is extremely, extremely, extremely important. It is something that is extremely important. PFC actually has a lot of important functions when it comes to the daily life of a person, especially with regards to decision making, especially with regards to emotional regulation. So, since the child, his PFC is developing, it basically leads to them not having the ability of proper judgment, right? And that basically, give rises to difficulty in assessing long-term consequences of action. So that's why we often see teenagers or taking actions that are very impulsive and that are very damaging and that are very destructive, that might be very diabolical, without looking at the future consequences of what those actions actually are, right? The next very aspect of of brain development when it comes to the teenage phase is the development of amygdala. Now, what is amygdala? Amygdala is a very important part of the brain, and it has a lot of functions when it comes to processing of emotions, specifically with regards to the fear that a child experiences, the anger that a child experiences, and the sadness that a child experiences. So, because the amygdala is basically on a progressive growth phase and it is not fully developed, what happens is when a child has to meet with certain situations where in which it stimulates and it triggers a lot of fear in their hearts, a lot of anger in their minds, and a lot of sadness in their psyche, they don't know how to process it. They don't know how to deal with it. They don't know how to engage with it. So that's also a huge issue. So in teenagers, the amygdala is more active than the PFC, right? So that also leads to heightened emotional reactivity. That's why we see teenagers engaging in actions without properly rationally thinking about it, right? They have a heightened sense of emotional faculty, right? Their emotional faculty is very active, and therefore they judge situations by the use of the emotional faculty in an emotional manner, and they jump into certain decisions. They jump into certain decisions. So that's also a very, very huge contributing factor to young people, young teens committing very destructive or engaging in very destructive activities, especially with regards to their decisions of ending their life. So there are a lot of other neuropsychological aspects to talk about, but since it's a very complicated subject, let me keep it simple and short. So during puberty, there's something called as HPA axis. It's a hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis, and it becomes highly active. It becomes very active, and that basically increases the release of a hormone called as cortisol. And cortisol, as we all know, it is basically the stress hormone, and that can also lead to the children experiencing more stress, right? And then we have the sex hormones, and we all know that in boys, when they enter the age of teenage, it leads to a heightened release of testosterone, and for the woman, it's for the girls, it's basically estrogen and progesterone. Now, for the boys, if they have entered the teenage phase, you would have seen your child being more aggressive. How many of you have seen that? As parents here who have teen boys, when they enter the teenage phase, you see that they're becoming more aggressive in home and outside. If you have experienced that, say yes in the chat. So experience that, say yes in the chat. You saw that your child has entered teenage and they have become extremely aggressive, and you don't know where this aggression is coming from. And it's actually due to the release of testosterone in their body. So that also leads to impulsive behavior combined with emotional struggles, and that raises the risk of acting on suicidal thoughts. Similarly, when it comes to girls, we're having hormones like estrogen and progesterone that are released quite a lot biologically in their body, and these hormones actually cause a lot of mood swings, particularly during the menstrual cycle. That's why we need to give sex education to the children. It's very important we give proper, morally based, value based, principled sex education to the children so that we make them aware that these changes are happening in their body and the aggression that they're facing is due to biological aspects that are working in their body, and they don't need to be overthinking about it, because a lot of children, since they don't know what is happening in their body, they overthink about it and they come to the conclusion that they have some problem, like they have some abnormality. We need to teach our children that it's a normality. It's something that is normal. It is something that is normal. So girls having more estrogen, progesterone, it contributes to a higher prevalence of depression and suicidal ideation in teenage girls compared to the boys. And similarly, when we look at teenagers when they develop in life, it's actually a phase of identity formation. Eric Erikson is actually a very well-known psychologist, and he has, uh, a theory of the stages of development. And in that, he basically says that adolescents are basically in the stage of identity versus role confusion. So they're basically trying to figure out who they are. They're trying to figure out where they come from. They're trying to figure out their roots. They're trying to create a persona, an identity in their minds. And that actually leads to the feeling of being lost, not being able to find clever answers, right? Because a lot of these questions are deeply philosophical questions, and these questions may not directly have answers, right, that these children can directly access, right? So failure to establish a sense of identity, it can also lead to something called as existential crisis. And I've met a lot of teenagers who are going through something called as existential depression. Existential depression can actually be a very clear cut route towards suicide as well, because it is so deeply saddening, because it's so deeply saddening. And then we have another important reason, and that is an environmental causal factor, and that is social media. Social media. Social media today, it has played a very huge role when it comes to a deterioration of mental health among children, among the teens. Subhanallah. Subhanallah. And the first way, it is basically by ideological brainwashing. Ideological brainwashing. The children are not taught a lot of these beautiful principles and values on social media. Absolutely not. But social media, a lot of the content that come in there are extremely toxic. Are extremely toxic. There's a lot of cyberbullying on social media, especially on Instagram. Especially on Instagram. The Instagram culture, generally, it is one of the most toxic culture compared to other social media platforms. Other social media platforms. Subhanallah. And not only that, we see a lot of these movies and real shorts that are coming up that are glorifying destructive behaviors, that are glorifying suicides. You look at a lot of these rap songs that are being released and launched and published. One of their themes, or the themes, will include something that is related to killing oneself. That is killing oneself, using drugs, sex, rock and roll lifestyle. A lot of these hedonistic lifestyles that are clear cut recipe for destructive behavior such as suicide. So, when teens use quite a lot of social media, it can affect the way they think. It can affect the way they view reality. Not only that, when children they use social media, what we need to understand is the social media platforms, Facebook, which is basically handled by Meta, WhatsApp, Instagram, Snapchat, YouTube, TikTok, etc. These platforms have people who are called as social engineers in their company. And social engineers, their main aim is to make sure that children are spending as much time as possible on social media. And for that, they try to make it as entertaining as possible. Now, in brain, there's a hormone called as dopamine, right? Dopamine, right? As parents, it's very important. We are very well aware of the roles of hormones and the role they play in the lives of our children. For example, the role that dopamine plays, the role of oxytocin, the role of serotonin, the role of endorphins. These four neurotransmitters are extremely important for the regulation of a child's psychology. It's very important. So these people, these social engineers, they try to make sure that the children become as addicted as possible to social media, and it is done through giving the children as many opportunities as possible for dopamine to be released in their brain. Now, what is dopamine? Does anyone know what dopamine is? You can type it in the chat. What is dopamine? It's actually a very well-known neurotransmitter hormone. What is dopamine? If you know what dopamine is, type it in the chat. Dopamine. Very good. Dopamine is the happy hormone. Dopamine is the pleasure hormone. So when you're engaging in an activity that gives you happiness, it's basically dopamine being released in your brain. That's how Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has created the brain. And it has a lot of functions. Let me not go into its neuropsychology. But dopamine, when it is released, there's a lot of pleasure. But when a person uses social media, the dopamine system basically gets hijacked and dysregulated. So there's a lot of constant exposure to social media that creates a perpetual cycle of dopamine hits. The more they get likes and the more they get comments and the more they get shares, the more dopamine is released in their brain, and that is artificial induction of or artificially triggered release of dopamine in the brain, and that creates a lot of other issues. They have mood swings. It creates a lot of mood swings. For example, a reel is basically 30 seconds to 1 hour, or one minute and 30 seconds, right? If a child spends 30 minutes on social media, if a child spends 30 minutes on social media, they might have actually watched close to 60 reels. And These reels, as they come up, some reels might be funny, some reels might be entertaining, some reels might be sad, some reels might be adventurous, some reels might be shocking, some reels might be trauma inducing, some reels might be extremely saddening, some reels might be depressive, some reels might be euphoric, etc. What happens is your child is basically going through a roller coaster of emotions, and just within these 30 seconds, their brain would have fogged up due to all these emotions being experienced in a very short duration of time. In a short duration of time. Subhanallah. So that actually creates a lot of cognitive issues. That actually leads to a lot of cognitive issues. And not only that, children who use social media quite a lot, they experience something called as FOMO. How many of you know what FOMO is? If you've heard about FOMO, say yes in the chat. FOMO. If you've heard about FOMO, say yes in the chat. FOMO is basically fear of missing out. You see, social media, it's basically a very delusional cyber reality, right? FOMO is basically fear of missing out. The fear that their life is not good as the lives of people they see on the internet. They see on the internet, subhanallah. So that basically makes them think that they're living a very depressed life, even though they have all the amenities. They will have they have a house, they have good parents, they're having food on the table, they have a lot of the ni'mah that Allah has given them. But then gratitude mindset is extremely important. And a lot of the young people don't have that. And due to social media use, they compare themselves to some guy who is living there in the hills of Hollywood, living his lifestyle, driving a Lamborghini, Murcielago, and eating the best food, traveling and touring through countries. And they compare their lives to those people, subhanAllah. SubhanAllah. And then we have these celebrities who are ideally representing suicide as if it's something good. There are a lot of issues that are happening on social media. So social media is also a big causal factor for the increase of suicides in this day and age. And then we have academic and parental pressure. We have this academic and parental pressure, and that's too huge. Academic stress today, it is something that is going through the roof. It is going through the roof. Subhanallah. And not only that, the pressure that the parents put on the child when exams come, and exams is actually very close. March, April is basically the exam time, and children are in extreme stress. Children are in extreme stress. And parents, they don't know how to properly guide the child when the child is going through this stress. And because of them having this delusional mindset that everything in life is marks, let me ask you, my dear parents, does a child win in life just because they score 100 or 100? Say yes or no in the chat. Does a child win in life because they have scored 100 out of 100 in their 10th standard examination or plus one examination or plus two examination? Yes or no? Never, absolutely not. Absolutely not. We have this desi mindset that has been that has immigrated from the past generation. That basically thinks that a child only has three or four options: either they become a doctor or an engineer or a lawyer or a loser, as if they don't have any other social standing than the marks they get. And we have this education system that is extremely problematic. I used to work as a research analyst for an educational consultancy, and one of the major projects that we did was analyzing the education systems across the world: Japan, Finland, India, Bangladesh, etc. And subhanallah, the education system we have in India is extremely messed up. It is extremely messed up. And not only that, the kind of delusion that we pressurize our children to believe in, that is also extremely problematic, right? We make the children think that if they have failed exams or if they've scored less in exams, their life is lost. Their life is lost. They have become a failure in life. They've become a failure in life. We have a system. We have a system where in which our children are forced to basically sit in rigid boxes we call as classrooms, and then they're forced to swallow information. And then we have a memory test examination we call as entrance examinations, or we see that as IQ tests. And then these kids are basically forced to memorize this information and vomit this information in the examination hall. And then they are given two-digit scores, and we are then teaching these children to think that their entire destiny in life is determined by these two-digit scores that they have scored in this memory test, basically. And that's the system of education that we have today. A system that does not give any importance to creativity, a system that does not give any importance to critical thinking, a system that does not give any importance to out of box thinking, a system that does not focus on proper skill development, life skill development of our children. And the system is extremely rigged and problematic. And subhanallah, our children going through the system with extreme academic stress, not getting the freedom that they deserve to get, not getting the development that they deserve to get, not getting the growth that they deserve to get in this phase of life. And then they come back home and they hear their parents, their mother and their father telling them study, 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 study 24/7, as if it's an alarm clock that cannot be stopped. And then you expect your children to have good mental health? Subhanallah. SubhanAllah, we got to think it is time we introspect. One of the reasons why I'm talking so strongly is because I see these children, I engage with these children. Being a counselor, I talk with these children, and I know the problems that they're going through. I know how challenging it is for them. And a lot of times, parents tend to ignore it, and they tend to downplay it, they tend to undervalue it, and then they pressurize the children. And we need to understand a teen's brain it's having heightened emotional sensitivity, and it makes them internalize these failures. When you tell your child that you're a failure, without getting good marks, you don't have any value, what happens is they internalize this as their identity. They internalize this as their identity, subhanallah. So it's very, very, very problematic, my dear brothers and sisters. So there are a lot of factors. There are a lot of factors. I'll cover one more factor and we'll talk about the warning signs, inshallah. With regards to the factors, our children might also have depressive symptoms. Our children might also be going through mental health problems. So generally, we just talked about the general reasons why teens are vulnerable to suicide. But one of the core reasons why children go to suicide is actually because of mental health problems, mental health abnormalities. Suicidal tendency is actually a symptom of many other psychological disorders, So we need to be clearly cognizant of it, right? Whether our child has depression, whether our child is going through, you know, issues that are causing, a lot of trauma in their life, etc. And oftentimes, children they may never share it. Children never share it. Subhanallah, children never share it, and the children today they have this thought that my parents will never understand me. How many of you have heard this from the children around you, that they always complain about their generation of parents, that they don't understand us? How many of you have heard that? Say yes in the chat. It's a very common complaint, right? In counseling, this is like one of the most common complaints that we get to hear. And what is the complaint? The complaint is basically this: my parent doesn't understand me or can't understand me due to the huge generation gap that's out there. Subhanallah. So oftentimes your child may not express it, but if you need to see those signs in them, it is very, very important. It is very, very important that we have a connection with them, that we have a proper connection with them. All right. Now, when it comes to suicides, there are two important types of suicides. Let me just, can you guys see the board? Is the board visible? Can you see the blackboard? Is it visible? All right. So when it comes to suicide, let me just make it as brief as possible, inshallah. When it comes to suicides, there are two types of suicide. There is the premeditated suicides, and then we have the second kind, that is the impulsive reactionary suicides. Okay. Now, two types. We have the premeditated suicides, and then we're having the impulsive reactionary suicides. The premeditated suicides are basically children going through specific stress in their life. They're facing depression, they're facing a lot of issues, and then they plan suicide as a near possibility or a far possibility. Now, in this type of suicide, we get to see symptoms. What do we get to see? We get to see clear symptoms, which we're going to be discussing now. So it's very, very important, very, very important that we understand these symptoms, But when it comes to impulsive reactionary suicides, as the name itself is signifying, it's impulsive. It is impulsive. And because it is impulsive, what happens is it becomes very, very hard to basically prevent. It becomes very, very hard to prevent the suicide because it's extremely impulsive. So let me just first focus on impulsive reactionary suicide for now, and then we'll go into the symptoms of premeditated suicide. Now, impulsive reactionary suicide, it happens due to what? Impulsive impulsive behaviors. As we mentioned earlier, the prefrontal cortex of the children, it may not be fully developed, right? The amygdala may not be fully developed. The hypothalamic system may not be fully developed. And due to this lack of development in the cognition of the children, they will often have impulsive behavior. They will often have impulsive behavior. So if the child is choosing suicide over impulsive behavior, it's very, very hard for us to stop it because we don't get the opportunity or the space or the time duration to basically see the signs of suicide. So what can we actually do to prevent such kinds of suicide? It is by teaching our children proper emotional regulation. By teaching our children proper emotional regulation, we need to focus on something called as EI training. EI training. What is EI training? EI training is basically emotional intelligence training. Emotional intelligence training, which need to be given to the children. And subhanallah, after the death of my close friend and student Mihir, I've been working on a research project which is focused on giving emotional intelligence training to children, and I'm trying to build a syllabus on it, inshallah. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala accept this as a sadaqatul jariyah for Mihr, and may He forgive our brother and unite us all in Jannah. Now, EI training is one good way of making sure our children don't go into suicide as an impulsive behavior. As an impulsive behavior. So it's an extremely, extremely important topic. I wish our schools taught emotional intelligence. I wish our children were trained in emotional regulation in the schools, but very sadly, our children are not taught these topics. All right. Now, coming to the second types of suicide, that is the premeditated suicide. So the child is basically going through a lot of issues, and now they are seeing suicide as a far or near possibility. When that happens, we get to see something called as symptoms, right? Signs of suicide. What are the signs? The first category are the behavioral signs. We say that such children, they suddenly withdraw from their friends and family. They suddenly withdraw from their friends and family, and they also lose interest in activities they once enjoyed. For example, the case of a child who committed suicide, when we read his case report, he really loved to play football, but then before a few weeks of him committing suicide, he stopped playing football. He was there in the school football team, but he opted to basically go out of the team, right? It was astonishing for his parents. But then his parents actually took it as something positive. So his parents basically thought that now he'll get more time to basically study. But for him, stopping, himself from playing football was basically a sign of suicide. The parents did not know that. And then we have a lot of risk-taking behaviors or giving away personal possessions. Another case report was basically a child who committed suicide, but before doing that, 4 days before him committing suicide, he gave away his PS5. It was PS4 or PS5. I can't remember the exact device, but it's PlayStation, something that is used for gaming. And his father and mother was extremely astonished because this boy, he was basically telling them to buy PS5 or PS4 for him for a lot of time. He got it, was extremely happy. They were, taking away PS5 from him was basically like taking away oxygen. He loved it quite a lot. But then when he gave it away, his parents were extremely shocked, right? His parents were extremely shocked. So giving away personal possessions is also a very huge red flag that we need to look at, right? Now, giving away personal possessions in of itself is not an issue. Some children might be altruistic; they may want to help their friends, etc. But if it is done in an abnormal fashion, then we need to be very cognizant. Then we are having emotional signs, expressions of hopelessness, feeling like a burden or discussing death. We see that the children who premeditate suicide, who pre-plan suicide, they will have a tendency to talk about death more, right? They will idealize death, right? They will talk about death a lot more, and you'll see similar themes in their general conversations. So that's also a huge red flag that we need to be looking at. And then we have extreme mood swings. Extreme mood swings. We see that the boy or the girl is suddenly becoming extremely angry, And then after 5 minutes, it's gone, and now they're crying, there's sadness, and they have become calm. But then after that, it keeps on changing and changing and changing, right? A lot of parents, they think that, okay, in teenage phase, such things are normal, mood swings will happen, and they, ignore such, red flags. But we need to understand, of course, that teenagers will go through such phases, but if it's coming in an abnormal fashion, without a specific causal factor that you are not able to point out or indicate, then it's something that we need to be very careful about. And then we have a physical signs. Number one is basically changes in sleeping patterns. It's either insomnia, which is trouble going to sleep, or it's going to be oversleeping. Changes in sleeping patterns is something that is very important. When a person comes to us for counseling, a few important questions we ask them is basically this. Number one is with regards to their sleep. Number two is with regards to their food intake. And number three is with regards to their movement, their kinesthetic movement, exercising, etc. Right? So sleep is actually so important. Sleep is so important. I do remember while I was attending a camp in Calicut Medical College, it was handled by a doctor, and it was about CBT, cognitive behavioral therapy, and he basically mentioned sleep as the first thing. Right? I do remember having a conversation with him, and he said something that is extremely astonishing. He said that without having good quality of sleep, you can expect that person to be a victim of almost all the psychological disorders that you can find in the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Psychology, which is basically a medical compilation of psychological disorders. So sleep is extremely important. Sleep is extremely important. The person who has not slept properly, you'll get to see that he'll have a lot of issues. Right? I do remember having a counseling case day before yesterday. This was from Qatar. I was talking to a guy who has not slept for 3 to 4 days due to a lot of work stress, etc. I was talking to him, and subhanAllah, his mind was like on drugs. His mind was like it was on drugs. His thoughts were very incoherent. It was like a living dead person, right? SubhanAllah. So sleep is extremely important. We got to ensure that our children are getting proper sleep. So if you see sudden changes in their sleep patterns, it can actually be a clear indication of suicidal tendency. Then there is the sudden weight loss or sudden weight gain due to eating disorders. Now, a lot of children, for them, a coping method is basically eating, right? So if you see that the child is having extreme weight loss or extreme weight gain due to specific emotional struggles that they're going through, that is also a red flag we need to look at. Now, the next question is parenting strategies, guiding through the storm. So we're talking about the storm right now, the catastrophe of teen suicide. Now, the next question is imagine we see such problems in our children. What should we do? I want a few of you to type your thoughts in the chat. What can we do if we see such red flags in our children? I'll wait for some time so that you guys can brainstorm and type your opinions in the chat. All right, so I'm seeing a few answers in the chat. Spending more time with them, very good answer. Getting in touch with a counselor, extremely important. Getting a professional help is extremely important. Try to converse with them and understand the underlying issues, beautiful answer. Listen to them, exactly, very good, very good. So these are all beautiful answers. Now let's think about strategies that we can execute, we can apply if we see our children going through such a storm. Number one is to make sure that they have a like they are in a safe, make sure you make them feel that they are in a safe environment, that they are in a supportive environment. So for that, you need to create a safe and supportive environment in the home. For a lot of children, they detest going to the home. They resent going to the home. Why? Because their home is basically jail for them, right? And the parents are basically jailers or prisoners, or the prison guards, and they're basically the prisoner. They look at home like that. Absolutely no, that should not be the case. When they think about home, they should get peace and tranquility, right? For that to happen, we got to have a safe and supportive environment in home. And for that to happen, we got to have what in home? Open communication. Practice active listening. Listen not to respond, but to understand. Listen not to respond, but to understand. Avoid dismissing their feelings with statements like, you're too young, you're too young to be stressed. What problems do you have in your life, right? You're having a home, you don't have a job, you don't have a family. So what are you so stressed about, right? Don't undervalue their stress. Don't ignore their stress. Don't reject their feelings. Let them feel heard and respected without judgment. Validate their emotions. Validate their emotions. A lot of parents have the habit of insulting their children in the name of just joking and humor, while they don't understand the impact it can have on the child. The second is to recognize the importance of connection. You know what? One of the biggest problems with life today in the 21st century is that we're living a very fast life. We don't have time for anything. We don't have time to connect with our children. And subhanAllah, after the industrial revolution that happened in the early 1930s and 40s. We know the history of World War II, and after that we see the rise of various postmodern movements, secularism, feminism, a lot of these isms which basically made sure that both the mother and father also has to work. And due to this work culture that we have, of the mother going out of the home and the father going out of the home, and the children are basically there alone, and then we leave the responsibility of parenting to specific institutions, to academies, to schools, and to boarding schools to try children have witness connection in parents. Studies show that even 10 minutes of undistracted interaction daily builds stronger bonding. I think it's important. But in this fast world, we don't have time for it. Hello, can you hear me now? Is my voice audible now? All right. So what I'm trying to say is it's very important we have a strong bond with our children. And one way to do that is to have regular dinners, group dinners and a group breakfast. But a very sad reality in a lot of homes is basically that my voice is still not clear. Okay, what about now? I think there's internet fluctuations here in my area. Can you hear me now? It's better, right? Okay. So it's very important that we have regular dinners and regular breakfasts. Obviously, with regards to lunch, it may not always be possible because of the children going to school and the parents being in the office, but at least the breakfast and the dinner, make sure you have it as a group, as a team together. Have game nights, play with your children. Play with your children. I'm not talking about just video games, I'm talking about physical activities, right? Playing with your children. Just ask yourself, how long has it been since you played with your child, right? Playing football with your child, playing cricket with your child, whatever the game that the child likes. How long has it been since you played with this child? So it's very important that we play with children, and especially when it comes to development psychology, games also actually contribute quite a lot to the development of the child. The child learns a lot of things when it comes to playing games. Right? SubhanAllah, there are quite interesting research studies that have been done on the effect of playing football as a team on the child's physical and psychological development, right? So games is something we should not be undervaluing. We should let children play. Children are children, let them play, right? Let them play and also play with them. When your child sees that you are playing with them, the value they give you is going to be something very different. The dynamic that they're going to be having with you is going to be very different. So it's very important we have game nights. It's very important you have long walks, traveling together as a family. Let me ask you this. How many of you travel together as a family? Say yes in the chat. How many of you travel together as a family, going for long trips, at least once a month? If you do that, say yes in the chat. Okay, my audio is not clear now. If you're a person who go for long trips, at least once a month with family, say yes in the chat. It's very important. It is extremely, extremely important. It creates memories, beautiful memories in our child's life. I do remember looking back into my life. I grew up in Qatar, alhamdulillah, and my father, one of the reasons why we have very strong bonds. And whenever I think about my parents, I get memories of the travels. We used to travel from Qatar to Saudi. We used to travel for the long road trips from Bahrain and Dubai, and going for these long trips. It gives a lot of possibilities for the parent to build very strong bonds with the child. So I will highly recommend the parents here have proper plan to take your children for long trips. To take your children for long trips. Let them enjoy together as a family. Enjoy together as a family. And the next is basically teaching emotional regulation skills. This is something we don't have in our education system. We don't have this in our education system. I wish our schools taught emotional intelligence and emotional regulation more than any other subject. More than any other subject. This is extremely important. It's top priority. Top priority. So encourage your child to learn regulation, emotional regulation. Teach them. If you don't know personally how to teach them, connect them with mentors. That's something we do in Mentorsa. Like we help children basically develop themselves emotionally and connect deeply with their spirituality. And spirituality is something that is very much related with mindfulness. So encourage mindfulness practices, breathing exercises, journaling, etc., to basically help them manage their emotions, right? That's extremely, extremely important. You train them for managing stress in their life. And some parents, they're so overprotective of their children that until the child is reaching, higher secondary and plus one and plus two, until they graduate that, they'll not let the child out of the home. They'll not let the child face any challenge in life, so that they grow up as spoon-fed babies, like overgrown babies who are studying in plus two and they go to college and now they are exposed to the real world and now they don't know how to engage with the real world. A small stress comes and they break and they fall onto the ground crying and they have depression and they have trauma. SubhanAllah. So it's extremely important we teach our children emotional regulation. And the next is basically setting healthy boundaries around technology. This is something that is very commonly discussed. So let me not go into deeper discussion on this due to the lack of time as well. So limit screen time. We talked about the problems that social media basically has. So have healthy boundaries when it comes to their social media use. The next is equipping them with problem solving skills. Is extremely important, right? Give them specific tasks to do. And when they face hardship in the task, give them the space to basically identify the problem, analyze the situation, and give the solution. So it's something that can be developed through proper training, right? You can have a lot of role play training, real life challenges that you can give to your children. It can actually be done in the games itself. When you do that in the games itself, children get a real life, ability to basically engage with these challenges, right? And finally, my dear brothers and sisters, it is this: if you see any of the symptoms, do not, you know, undervalue it, like do not ignore it, do not reject it. At the same time, connect with a professional, a mental health professional, a psychologist. And subhanAllah, very sadly, a lot of psychologists we have today, they're not very capable. So it's very important when you look for a psychologist, look for people who are very skilled. who are very skilled and who have expertise when it comes to engaging with children and connecting with them so that the children can relate to them. Right? That's also something that is extremely important. So seek professional help when the storm gets fierce, my dear brothers and sisters. This is not something, this is not a game that we should be playing around with. Right? A child's life is extremely important. When we lose it, that's when a lot of regret sets in. And that regret, it is unchangeable. That is a regret that we will have to live with, my dear brothers and sisters. It's extremely important that we look at suicides as something that is extremely shocking, and we give it the right attention and awareness that it rightly deserves. And subhanAllah, today we have a lot of stigma around it, right? Going to a psychologist is something that is seen as taboo, right? SubhanAllah. So we need to have open discussions about it. We got to advocate for open discussions about mental health in the schools and communities and the masajid, subhanAllah. You go to specific people today and you tell them that you have a depression, they just tell you to read Quran and read a few hadith. Obviously, reading Quran is very spiritually powerful, but we got to understand that psychological disorders can also have neurological and psychiatric pointers and causal factors, right? Similar to how if you fall down and you have a physiological problem, a fracture in your bone, you seek treatment. Similarly, you got to seek treatment for this as well. You got to seek therapy. You got to seek counseling. So you got to have open conversations about it. You got to have open conversations about it. Educate others on the difference between sadness and clinical depression. Make them understand the importance of mental health. My dear brothers and sisters, whoever seeks a life, it will be as if they seek all of mankind. This is what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says in chapter number 5, verse number 32 of the Holy Quran. So this death that has happened in our community, I know you're all shocked, just like I am. It was extremely saddening and unfortunate for me as well to basically see that happen in the society. SubhanAllah, we must all make sure that this never ever occurs in our community. We got to take steps. We got to take steps, my dear brothers and sisters. As parents, it is a huge responsibility that we have on our shoulders. It is a communal responsibility. We got to bring in initiatives, inshallah, that addresses the mental health of our children. And inshallah, one of the projects that we're planning under Mentorsa, it is basically to clearly give this topic the right attention that it deserves, to connect with schools and academies around the world, inshallah, to create a proper syllabus and teach it to children, teach emotional regulation to children, teach emotional intelligence to children, subhanAllah. This is something extremely important. We need to keep this in our mind. The brother who has passed away, I see him as my child. And as parents of the community, we should all see him as our child. The pain that we feel, we got to channel it to constructive pathways by bringing in initiatives that are fruitful to the society. So, in the memory of that brother Mihir, inshallah, it can be a source of sadaqat al jariyah for him as well. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala bless him. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala forgive him. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala unite him with all of us and us with him in Jannat al-Firdaus al-A'la. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala make these initiatives that we are planning to bring forth and the efforts that are being put forward day and night to be a source of sadaqat al-jariyah for him. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala make this initiative a door for transformation for thousands of young children who are suffering in the depths of darkness, of hopelessness, of depression, not being able to find a door or a ventilation point, a space to basically tell their struggles and open up. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala bless us all. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala accept this as a salih al-amal from all of us. Ameen ya Rabbil Alameen. Give mental health the importance that it deserves so that we don't regret in the future. With that, we conclude. وآخر دعوانا الحمد لله رب العالمين. السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته.